Hello once again, everybody. We are back, and today we are going to be talking about the later Persian empires, or, the successors of the Great Persian Empire, and hopefully we'll be able to take a little less time explaining about them. So let's just jump right in. Okay, when last we left Persia, it was obliterated and destroyed by one Alexander the Great. And after Alexander the Great died, he was not smart enough, unfortunately, because he was so young, to name an heir to come after him. And so what ended up happening is his generals basically grabbed as much of the empire of Alexander as they could. And the one main guy that took the biggest empire was the general Seleucus, as we see right here. And as you can see, Seleucus was the one that undoubtedly got the largest of these empires, which was really almost all of ancient Persia minus Egypt, which was controlled by the general Ptolemy, and part of Asia Minor. Now, unfortunately for Seleucus, within just the first few years of his actual reign, this area up here, which is known as Bactria, which is Bactria, was lost because it was just too big. And unfortunately, he really had a problem in which he was dealing with constant warfare from the other generals. Then, after Seleucus died and going on, the problem of Alexander's empire is that it was a multi-ethnic empire. And what we have seen over time is that multi-ethnic empires tend to break down because the ethnic groups want their own empire. And as a result, he was dealing with almost constant war. Now, there was a flowering of certain civilization and learning, and that's why I bring up the great city of Pergamum. Pergamum was located right around here by the mouse and was one of the centers of learning in the world. In fact, it had a library that even rivaled that of Alexandria. And we'll be talking about that in a separate video when I talk about the Greeks and Alexander. Unfortunately, this was just a great example of the empire was too big. There were too many people that were pulling it in different directions. Eventually, the Romans will show up in the east and knock them out. And then another group, starting around the 200s, will start to give them problems out here until finally you get them being just conquered and shattered around the year 63. The successor to these guys, and a group that was incredibly impressive for really, as you see here, a period of about 420 years, would be the Parthians. The Parthians would form an empire from the year 247 to 224. They start in the eastern part of the empire, and they start in northern Iran. These guys aren't Persian, but they are descended from them. They are a similar ethnic group. What really gave them a tough time in forming an empire is that for the most part they were tribal groups, and they were dealing with the nomads. They just keep coming and they won't stop bothering people over and over and over again. But eventually what ends up happening is that the nomads get themselves in trouble because the Parthians are able to get some horses from them. In particular, that the Parthians are able to develop the group that we call today heavy cavalry. And there's some evidence that this really was the world's first heavy cavalry, right around the year 200 to 250, somewhere around there, in that they armored themselves, and then what they did is they bred very large horses that were both fast and powerful. And when you can do that, as of course I have here, you can wreck shop. The Parthians were going to be able to grow. They set up a very large emperor, and their biggest leader was this guy on the right, Mithridates I. You know a guy is awesome when he's got a lion for a hat. I mean, think about that. I'm wearing a lion. I don't care if he hunted the lion or not. If I'm someone that lives 2,200 years ago and I see some dude walking around with a lion on him, I'm scared. Especially it's got the big teeth and stuff like that. Forget that. He is the guy that finally is going to really push out the Seleucids. Remember, the Seleucids were there, as I talked about. They were kind of butting up against each other, but it's Mithridates that just kind of drops the hammer on them. And what he's going to do is he's going to go back to his ancestors, the Persians and the Achaemenid dynasty, and he is going to do things like tolerance, using spies, using governors and satrapies. And what he's going to be really smart is the areas that he conquers, he's basically going to make the former nobility the satraps. So it's a brilliant move. It's like, hey, I conquered you, but I'm still going to give you a bunch of power back. And really, he is going to be able to grow this empire to its greatest height. But unfortunately, all things come to an end. In the year 224, they eventually are going to be usurped in power by a new group that comes into play here, a group called the Sassanids, which I'll talk about in a moment. As you can see here, the Parthian Empire, quite big. It goes from Turkey over to this area here, which is kind of all modern-day Iran, and maybe a smidge into Afghanistan. Okay, but still much smaller than the original Persian Empire. We're not getting into Pakistan, and we're most certainly not getting into India. Although they have a lot of money, as you can see here, we've got some nice coinage, and they made these huge sculptures, and a little bit of influence of the Greeks here. You see Mithridates meets Hercules. So you have really interesting types of theological beliefs, but nonetheless, this was a pretty accomplished empire. And they also gave us a cool thing. You might have actually heard of the phrase "a parting shot," that you say one last thing to someone when you're leaving. Well, that comes from the Parthians and the idea of the Parthian shot. Here you see a modern day recreation of a Parthian soldier. Now, the Parthians had the world's first heavy cavalry, but they also had light cavalry. And what you see here is what they would do is this military tactic where they would move their horses around and then they would swing in front of their enemy and start to what would seemingly be a retreat. The enemy would then start to advance, and then these guys, who at the time were probably the best bowmen in the world, would wheel around with these very strong composite bows, as you see these guys here, and shoot a volley of arrows at them, most often decimating their opposition. And what the Parthian shot became is the parting shot. So now when you hear that concept of parting shot and you give someone a parting shot, now you actually know what it comes from. The final empire in this area that we talk about are the Sassanids. And what you can see here, the Sassanid would be a very, very large empire. They would take over the Parthians, then they would move into Mesopotamia, and then they would move up and down the coast of modern-day Arabia. And actually, the first empire to do that. The Persians never did it, and neither did Alexander. Their biggest leader was this guy named Sharper the First, who actually made carvings of himself in the side of mountains, which was pretty awesome. These guys are crucial because they're really going to be the guys that help blow up trade. Trade is going to be so vital. One of the videos you're going to be watching soon is on the Silk Roads, and it's the Sassanids that really, really expand the Silk Roads and then will help take them to greater levels after that. The Sassanids were the middlemen. If you see here, the reason I use this map, and I'll show you a different map, is you see all those names there? All of those are actually cities and provinces. And these guys would build these provinces and these cities all over the place so that merchants would have places to trade. And it's because of that that you're going to get trade that now really will go from China all the way to Rome and as far out to the Spanish provinces of Rome. And of course, a lot of this is driven by food. It is now we get India and China are going to start to bring rice, sugarcane, citrus fruits, eggplants, and cotton into the fold here. And these are going to be crops that are going to really help people with their overall health. They will be huge trades, especially things like rice, which of course can be stored for long periods of time. And it really will take the Sassanid Empire to the one successor of Persia that almost got as big and was almost as powerful. Unfortunately for these guys, they had two things working against them. One, they had to fight the Romans, and they fought the Romans a lot. As much as they would trade with them, the Romans always wanted to expand, which would cause weaknesses, and eventually the big group that takes them out would be the Arabs and the expansion of Islam, and we will talk about how successful they will be. But three successive empires, all really huge in this wonderful area in which trade and knowledge is going to be spread. And this gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So the Sassanids were here. Here you have the Gupta Empire. We're going to talk about them in India. And then, of course, you have the Romans over here. Here is Sharpur the First. Pretty awesome. That's like 60 feet high, by the way. All of that done with chisels. Now, what are some of the incredible things that these empires did along with the regular Persians? Gee, let's look here because, again, it's just fascinating and no one gets the credit for it. And once again, we refer back to our friends, the 300, on how they messed this up. All right, so first and foremost, it was a male-dominated empire. Women did not have tons of rights. They really were at the top. However, you get a new class of people that develop, and bureaucrats, the administrators. Before, this nobility that existed in this area in the world really was solely based on clan leaders or the nobility or kind of soldiers and people that were able to have land a long time ago. But now, because these empires were all so big, the bureaucrats and the governors were crucial, and most of them actually had the true political power. And you could get a random bureaucrat that was appointed by the king or a shah that could throw a clan leader in jail or exile him if he was going against the will of the king. And what we're eventually going to see is that these guys become the new leadership. That in this part of the world, this focus on bureaucrats. And if you think about it, it's no different today. Even though there are people like Bill Gates and maybe some famous athlete that can do lots of things in your country, in the end, the people that run it are our senators and our congressmen, and that they work together and they have tremendous amounts of power. And we get that. Okay, from really the Persian empires. They were the first one to do it. You also get an incredible concept here. I have commoners. The fact of the matter is everybody is pretty much free. Okay, I have here different approaches to this. The idea that you have artisans and craftsmen, priests and priestesses, and these workers. The Persians had very few slaves, and slaves could actually rise up to to pretty exalted heights and serve the Shah himself. Who were the slaves? For the most part, they were POWs, or people who rebelled against the government. Slaves could be people who actually went into debt and had to work off their slavery, but they weren't traded, they weren't bought and sold. Now, let's be honest, if you have a slave, that's still not nice. Slavery is bad. But this is not the chattel slavery that you would see everybody else. The commoners, they worked for a living. They were paid in grain and wine and sometimes beer and meat because agriculture was the basis of the economy. The only people really dealing with money were the merchants. And so, and then out in the country, the peasants, the farmers, they actually owned land. These guys could move from place to place. They could buy other land. Okay, it was incredible. And then they sold their crops, or some of their crops were used for taxes. So again, we see this kind of enlightened culture that, again, just because the Greeks said they were barbarians, we think they were. And we couldn't be further from the truth.